I am disappointed. What I've noticed over the years about myself, and others of course, is that soon after a disappointment, we tend to lash out at the source of our disappointment. An emotional reaction. After a few days, the emotions may have died down a little, but the disappointment is still there. And it's at this point where we begin to look upon the situation a bit more pragmatically. And soon after that comes some pretty depressing feelings as we realise that there is basically nothing we can do to change the situation. After this many videos about the Radeon Technologies Group losing and Nvidia winning, there comes a point where mulling over this one-sided slaughter has to come to an end. So fair warning, this video, like so many others I've done about the PC graphics market before, is gonna make pretty depressing viewing for a lot of people watching it. RDNA, CDNA. Two different architectures from AMD's Radeon Technologies Group. Why have two different architectures though? It's simple. Two different market segments with very different needs. Those being the consumer segment, which boils down to game consoles and PC and notebook graphics, and the other segment is for HPC and machine learning. Supercomputers, basically. The world's fastest supercomputer is ORNL's Frontier. And inside of this are AMD Milan CPUs and Radeon Instinct MI250X GPUs. Frontier is so fast, it is about 2.5 times faster than the next fastest supercomputer on the list. And AMD and Radeon are also third fastest, with Nvidia down here in 4th and 5th. But you might be thinking, yeah, but this is all about Zen, it's got nothing to do with Radeon. But that's not the case. There are 9,472 epic 64-core CPUs in Frontier, and 37,888 MI250X GPUs. So 4 times more GPUs than CPUs. So it's not difficult to grasp just how important Radeon is to AMD and AMD's financials in particular, with products in the data centre, in client, and obviously in gaming. Now, data centre, that's where the big money is at, the big profits, which we can see doubled from last year, from about $1 billion up to $1.85 billion. That's bottom line. And this is the kind of thing that causes the stock to rise. But as you can see, with the gaming segment, that was actually AMD's largest segment by revenue in 2022. Just a bit higher than data centre and client. It won't be in 2023, however. And it never will be again. And it's also worth noting that even with the most revenue, the profits are lowest even behind client profit, and obviously only about half of data center. And client is basically rising notebooks and PCs. So what is this gaming segment then? As I just noted, the revenue is highest and it's gone up by 1.2 billion year over year. However, we can see that all that extra revenue only resulted in a measly extra profit of what's that, $19 million. 1.2 billion more in sales for $19 million profit. That is pretty poor. And recently I was made aware on Twitter of a very interesting fact. One company, which we believe to be Sony, accounted for 16% of AMD's revenue in 2022. That's the entire company revenue. And when I asked where this information came from, I was pointed to AMD's Financial Report 2022, where I found this. Customer A, 16% as noted, and no other companies attributed more than 10% of AMD's total revenue last year. Last year we can see there were two companies at 14 and 11% respectively, and also sales to customers A and B, consisted of sales of products from the gaming and client segments respectively. Now AMD's gaming segment is all of the console socks, your Xbox and your PlayStations, and Radeon PC graphics. And as I said, it's believed that customer A, 14% last year, 16% this year, has to be Sony. Simply put, Sony are selling more consoles than Microsoft. But these numbers were still pretty surprising to me. Not least of all because, as you know, the Xbox APU is larger than the PlayStation one. So AMD should be getting paid more per chip sold to Microsoft than they do to Sony. Therefore, even though Microsoft aren't showing as one of AMD's 10% companies, they really cannot be far away from 10%. They have to be 9%, maybe even 9.5%. Now, AMD's total net revenue for 2022 was $23.6 billion, which is crazy numbers for a company that couldn't do a thing right 7 or 8 years ago. And if you look back to 2 years ago, sales have more than doubled. But what's important about this is, we can now get a reasonable idea of how AMD's gaming segment revenue has to be split. Because this 16%, which is Sony's payments to AMD, out of $23.6 billion total revenue is $3.78 billion. And yeah, AMD does sell some data center products to Sony also, but we're likely talking less than 100 million revenue for that. Microsoft actually buys a lot more data center products, but regardless of that, we know that they're still below the 10% of AMD's total revenue. And if we assume, say, 9% of the total sales were to Microsoft, that 8% of them would have been the Xbox APU, and that would be $1.89 billion. So the total gaming sales to Sony and Microsoft should be around about $5.67 billion. And so that means the rest of AMD's gaming revenue, which remember also includes stuff like the Steam Deck, must only be around about $1 billion. Revenue, that is. Remember, the profit made by the entire gaming segment was only $953 million. And we will never get the exact numbers because those are only known to people high up inside of AMD. But it is very likely that the profit from AMD's PC graphics cards is less than $200 million a year. And it's probably closer to $100 million. But if somebody emailed me and said, actually Jim, they made a loss, I wouldn't argue with them. And if you remember my old video, the GPU war is over, you'll understand that Radeon has gone nowhere money-wise on the PC for over 10 years. Now to the main point of this video. One day in December 2022, AMD Executive VP Rick Bergman, Computing and Graphics Division, and AMD Senior Vice President David Wang of Engineering and the Radeon Technologies Division came to Japan, where they spoke with IT Media. And this obviously is a translation, so the usual caution is advised. But Rick and Dave were asked a bunch of questions, and one of their responses in particular caught the eye and ire of the tech-following crowd. When they were asked why won't AMD release an ultra-high-end GPU to compete with the RTX 4090, Rick responded with, technically, it is possible to develop a GPU with specs that compete with theirs. However, their GPU developed was introduced to the market as a graphics card with a TDP of 600 watts and a reference price of $1,600. And that was accepted by general PC gaming fans. But after thinking about it, AMD chose not to adopt such a strategy. Now just to pick all of this apart. Technically, it is possible to develop a GPU with specs that compete with theirs. Obviously, I discussed this possibility at length in my 2 RDNA 3 videos, and therefore I don't really see why this has been such a controversial comment, with some people saying that AMD are just being sore losers, they couldn't beat Nvidia if they tried. But to me it's just simple fact. AMD could have easily beaten the 4090 by a very large margin had they just built a 600mm GPU the same as Nvidia did. Why do people find this so hard to understand? Navi 31, the GCD part of it at least, which is the important part, at only 300 square millimeters, is smaller than Navi 22. That's a chip used in the 6700 XT, and it's 10% larger than Navi 31's GCD. As I said in this video, AMD's path to victory, had they chosen to take it, that is, AMD wouldn't even have to double that 300mm die size to get double the number of shaders. Around a 500mm die, dropping clocks by between 10 and 20% and increasing the power by 100 watts or so, and you basically get the exact same situation where the 6900 XT is about 50 to 55% faster than the 6700 XT. Same architecture, double the number of shaders at lower clock speed. Got them over 50% faster. Which means it would have to be 25 to 30% faster than the RTX 4090. It's really that simple. And in fact, now that they can decouple the shader clock and the front end clock, they could have a larger GPU that wasn't bottlenecked by front end clock speeds. They could drop the shader clocks further, ramp up the front end clock if they had to, and they would likely see an even larger jump than they saw between the 6700 XT and the 6900 XT. Why is this so hard to believe? They literally did it last year. Now, getting back to the interview, Rick also said that NVIDIA's RTX 4090 was introduced to the market as a graphics card with a TDP of 600 watts and a reference price of $1,600. What actually happened here was NVIDIA launched a card with the capability of dissipating 600 watts if they had needed it. But when they learned that AMD wouldn't be competing against their top card, they just lowered the TDP. And if you just look at one of the faster aftermarket 4090s, the Strix OC, the average power consumption during gaming is 360 watts. It's not even that much higher than the 4090 Founders Edition. If maybe a bit of an eye-watering 517 watts at maximum power. And for that extra power, they got about 3% more performance out of it. And according to Tech Power, overclocking it results in another improvement of about 4.5%. It would appear that had NVIDIA pushed to 600 watts, they might have got another 10 to 15% maximum out of the 4090. And with that, we can reasonably assume that the 4090 Ti will be somewhere between 15 and 20% faster than the 4090. AMD could have beaten NVIDIA's best even pushed to 600 watts. But the real point here is NVIDIA left a little headroom by hugely overrating their cooler. What did AMD do? They just did their usual. Because obviously, as you know, it's worked so well for them in the past. Now moving on, Rick continued with the RDNA 3 based GPU RX 7900 XTX released this time targets $999, which is considered to be the upper price assumed by high-end users among general PC gaming fans. And over the page he continued with, we haven't planned a $1,600 GPU like the competition, NVIDIA, for PC gaming fans in recent years. Instead, we are focusing on planning a GPU that fits in the $1,000 class with a good balance between performance and cost. The only word for this is bollocks. At no time did AMD plan to create a graphics card at a $1,000 price point. Here is why they did charge $1,000. It was simply because NVIDIA charged $1,200. Had NVIDIA not been so greedy, and had they charged even $799 for the 4080, keeping them in line with their historical price increases instead of this massive rise, AMD would have been forced to sell the XTX at $699. Can you imagine what would have happened had AMD tried to charge $1,000 for the XTX had the RTX 4080 only been $799 or even $899? They would have been laughed out of business. So it is crystal clear that there was no plan for a $1,000 graphics cards. It was priced that way simply because NVIDIA priced theirs at $1,200. That's a fact. And that is bad enough. But think about the side effect of that. What this actually means is that AMD now has got no incentive to launch their cards first any longer. They might as well just wait and see what NVIDIA charges first, and then price their own cards to match. Now I know, you can probably detect a bit of anger in my voice now, but it's simple really, to me at least. The Radeon Technologies Group has given up competing in performance when they know they could have won this generation, and they have given up competing in price. And let's not forget they just outright lied about the card's performance. The XTX was targeted at 6900 XT, 6950 XT buyers. Those are the only people paying $1,000 for this card. But the only way that AMD could convince them to pay that kind of money was with this deceptive branding, 7900 branding, up against an Nvidia 80 class GPU, deceptive benchmarking where they claimed they were 70% faster, but the real improvement was closer to 40%, and then waiting for Nvidia to price the 4080 at $1,200 so they could price theirs at $1,000. That is what happened. And in my opinion, this is worse than anything Nvidia has done to their own customers in a very long time. And for all you Nvidia fanboys watching this and feeling smug, this affects you as well, I'm afraid. Recall how Nvidia were embarrassed into massive price drops on the 2080 and 2060? 15 years ago, Jesus. Well, that will never happen again because Nvidia now knows that AMD will price to match instead of price to win market share, which means you can expect higher and higher prices all throughout Nvidia's range. So what has happened? As I said multiple times in these two videos, it all comes down to whether or not AMD even tries. And obviously I fully expected to see a similar situation as previous years where they launched smaller chips first on a new node, then followed up with the larger chips a year later, which would be this year if they've got a larger chip. But based on what Rick and David said in this interview, it just doesn't seem very likely to me. And I also asked around some of my leakers and was told twice that AMD had planned a faster card, but then decided against it. Now, just looking at some of this data, which I got ChatGPT to do for me, and it goes back to like 2004, even earlier than that, but just realised that a few of these might be a little bit off. We can see that Nvidia's die sizes in the blue here, 2004 to 2022. There's a clear rising trend still, but also we can see that the power, which had dropped a bit of course, here is Fermi years, so that's why it's so high, and then you had Maxwell to Pascal, but we can see now that they've really ramped up the power again, because they had to, in order to keep winning. And looking at AMD's die sizes and power over the years, up and down, that's the die size at least, which goes to show what they do. Smaller chip on the new node, larger chip a year later. Smaller chip on the new node, larger chip a year later. Smaller chip on a new node. Well, I guess we'll wait and see. And we can also see that they have been ramping up the power. There's Vega Liquid. But it isn't quite been enough to get really anywhere near what Nvidia's done. Comparing the die sizes, this is probably a little bit off here. But Nvidia's always had a decent advantage there. And comparing the power, we can see now the blue line here is Nvidia. They have just sort of pulled away these last few years. And essentially this is what it comes down to now for me, I think. You saw earlier in the video just how little money the Radeon Technologies Group makes in PC graphics. Honestly reckon you're talking $100 million profit per year. To me it now seems likely that they are just not prepared to spend real money on developing a real cooler in the way that Nvidia have done. And if AMD doesn't ramp up their cooling solution, then they also can't ramp up their power draw. So there's no need for them to launch a larger chip this year, which will save them even more money on design costs and on 5nm masks at TSMC. And if you consider all of that, that's running into $100 million saved, or pretty much their entire yearly profit. Of course, if that is AMD's strategy for 2023, then we can only expect to see another withering of market share this year and next. If they think that refreshing the XTX is going to cut it, then they have got another think coming. The difference between how both companies operate could not be clearer. Nvidia uses whatever levers they have available to them, and right now they are winning simply because they have this huge Founders Edition cooler, which they first introduced back in 2016 with Pascal. 6 or 7 years later and AMD have still not gotten par with it, and in fact now are probably further behind than ever. And what's more, it's obvious that Nvidia has an even larger cooler if they need one. That long-rumoured massive Titan shroud may well just be a development product for testing purposes, but it shows us exactly what Nvidia is thinking. If they need 600 watts, then they will have a cooler that more than does that job. And looking at the Steam Hardware Survey March 2023, it's clear to see how Nvidia's strategy is the obvious winner. RTX 4090 is on the list at 0.25% of the entire Steam market, which is quite a lot of cards, even though it doesn't appear to be a large number. Now let's see, 7900 XT, none. XTX, none. No 7000 series cards on that list yet. Now they did launch a bit later, but it doesn't matter. We've been here before, we know the story that I showed in the GPU war is over. Fact is, Nvidia is going to outsell AMD by 10 to 1 at least. But if AMD thinks there isn't a $1,600 market, there clearly is. But AMD's never going to win that market, because to win it you need to be in it. But it seems that their strategy today is really all about lying to their own buyers with dodgy benchmarks and then following Nvidia's pricing. And now, apparently, using chiplets to save money instead of using them to compete. That's actually worse for you because, as I said before, chiplets are a performance and power drawback. They're getting less performance and less power because of those chiplets, and yet they're still charging you $1,000 for it. I talked to Tom over at Moore's Law is Dead a few months back, just not long after AMD launched the cards, and I said then that if AMD doesn't launch a competing high-end graphics card in 2023, I am giving up on them. And to be honest, I really think that you should as well. When I said I was getting behind Intel graphics, I really meant it. And the reason was because they would at least compete with Nvidia. If not on performance, they'll at least compete on price. And Intel has proven that they are willing to compete in price, with their cards being much better value than anything else on the market today. Sure, they don't have the performance yet, but at least they are competing on price. Sadly though, with Raja leaving, I fear for the future of their graphics department. But I guess Nvidia fanboys can celebrate their win with $2,000 5090s and $1,400 5080s. Now, to finish this video up, it's shorter than usual because there's only so much you can flog a dead horse. I know a lot of you are AMD shareholders and I know a lot of you are AMD fans. The reality is, PC graphics are such a tiny part of AMD's business that it just simply doesn't matter to the company. Over the following years, this gaming revenue and profit is going to drop and drop due to less game console sales until the next generation is ready. And they'll go through this whole kind of boom and bust cycle again. It doesn't matter though really, because all of this is going to be more than offset by very large gains in the data center, both in client from Zen, but mostly in the data center from Zen and Instinct GPUs, as the clamour for artificial intelligence reaches fever point and AMD becomes a 30 billion revenue company, and then probably a 50 billion revenue company within 4 years, I reckon. It's not 2010 any longer. You don't need to buy AMD hardware because you feel you need to do something to save the company. And for me, it's reached the point where it's probably better that they just pull out of the PC gaming market altogether. It would be way more wafers for Zen and Instinct. Simple as that. If the Radeon Technologies Group isn't willing to compete in performance or price when they know they could win this generation, what is the point? Nvidia is already setting prices to what they believe they can get away with, and RTG is just following their lead, as usual. But I'm done here. I'm planning something very different for the next video, but I can already tell it's going to be a tough one. It could be fun and pretty far-reaching, I think, but if I do get that script together, I want to make sure it's done right. Something quite entertaining, rather than just a few boring slides and graphs as my usual. And also, as I've had a bit of a go at the Radeon Technologies Group here, I might just even up a bit by having a go at Nvidia next. Maybe as a filler video some point this month. And obviously, if anything else happens on the PC front, I'll get a video out on that in the meantime. But until then, I'll catch you later, guys.